So I think the best laid plans were derailed. And in fact, an ANC foreign policy is perhaps not the best inclined to cope with a health crisis. It's not necessarily where the ruling party's strengths lie.
South Africa has recently concluded a year of chairing the African Union, but was its chairing of the AU a success? Well, joining me to discuss this is Jessica van Onselen, who is a strategist and consultant who does a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa. Jessica, welcome back to the CRA channel. Could you tell our viewers what were the objectives that the SA government had going into its chairing of the AU, and did it meet those objectives?
As Cyril Ramaphosa concludes his year as chair of the African Union, I think it is safe to say that it has been an underwhelming performance. South Africa's foreign policy focuses on two key objectives. The first one is peace and security on the continent, and the second one is regional integration, including economic integration, which in theory should really prioritize South African businesses and expanding their footprint into the continent. So far, so good. But in fact, when assuming office in February 2020, Cyril Ramaphosa was greeted with the horror that was the burgeoning pandemic and the reality of COVID-19 and a continent that was ill prepared for treating, preventing, and dealing with the full extent of this pandemic. So I think the best laid plans were derailed. And in fact, an ANC foreign policy is perhaps not the best inclined to cope with a health crisis. It's not necessarily where the ruling party's strengths lie.
Okay, Jessica, well, you've highlighted the impact of COVID, but what about some other foreign policy events and trends that emerged on the continent over the last year?
So the ANC has really put a lot of its historical value in what it has to contribute to resolving conflict. It sees a lot of its value in negotiation and had identified conflicts in the area, including in the Sudan. There's the ongoing Libya crisis. There's the situation in Western Sahara. These are places that the ANC had said that they wanted to try and make positive interventions around peace and security. Also, adequately funding Peace Corps in a partnership with the UN on the continent. One of the biggest tests of this was the issue of the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which goes by the acronym GERD, which involves a long-standing conflict now between Ethiopia, upstream of the Nile, and Egypt, downstream of the Nile, involved in what seems like an intractable conflict about who has access to that water. Under Ramaphosa, they sought to guide and facilitate these negotiations while he was chair of the African Union. And even Naledi Pandor conceded in a week or two ago in a speech of hers that this was wholly unsuccessful. Despite their perceived credentials as a negotiator with a long struggle history, the ANC was unable to make progress with that. They conceded at the end of their chair that there was very little to show for it. And so the rising strength of Ethiopia under Abiy, perhaps Egyptian reluctance to sort of concede and be flexible around these negotiations, have resulted at the end of it in quite an embarrassing failure on the part of the ANC to resolve this really flagship issue of conflict on the African continent during their tenureship.
Okay, Jessica, well, you indicated that the South African government had two objectives in its chairing of the AU. On the one hand, peace and security, and on the other hand, regional integration. How did the government do on the peace and security question?
The African Union had a flagship initiative called Silencing the Guns. It began many years ago and was supposed to culminate in 2020 with the ending of violence, conflict, and genocide on the continent. It was always a moonshot initiative, but really setting the tone for how they wished to reduce conflict. And Cyril Ramaphosa's chairmanship was supposed to oversee the last mile of that as Silencing the Guns came to an end in 2020. And it has underperformed as an initiative, not least because we've seen the flaring up of the emerging civil war in Ethiopia, which I know you've covered on the channel, the conflict between the federal government in Addis Ababa and Tigray, which looks to be getting more and more serious, quite a humanitarian crisis spinning out of control there. There are a number of other conflicts in the continent which continue to flare. Instability in West Africa. Nigeria has plenty of problems over there. So once you come to the end and do a little bit of an evaluation, not just of the ANC's emphasis on peace and security, but the silencing of the guns, again, it doesn't look like this is something that's really taken the continent forward in a meaningful way during this period.
So Jessica, let's look now at regional economic integration. What indicators can we look to measure success in this regard? We've seen the African Continental Free Trade Agreement making some progress, although there's still a way to go in terms of genuine free trade in Africa. But what other measures can we look at to adjudicate South Africa's success in terms of promoting regional economic integration?
The commencement of trading with the African Continental Free Trading Area is no doubt an achievement, and I personally am quite excited to see where that leads itself. So that is one step closer towards the free movement of goods and the introduction of a customs union. That should be of particular interest to South African businesses, because if we can get that right, the potential for economic growth is really unlocked. I'm more than aware that there are plenty of obstacles. But of course, another element of regional integration, which is slightly more complicated, is the free movement of people. And this is going to be a sticking point inside the AU and inside SADC, and particularly for South Africa. One thing to operate at policy level and talk about wanting the freedom of movement between our neighbors, but when you look at the history of xenophobic attacks, a lot of ill feeling, the recent closing of the Beitbridge border post, just being the most recent example of how South Africa acts in reality around these policies, it's a lot more complicated. So regional integration is, again, an ambitious agenda, definitely something to aim for. We've seen a bit of progress on the economic side, but until you let skills move easily between African countries, I think this is some way off.
Well, Jessica, thank you very much. If you enjoyed this content, you might want to check out an earlier conversation that we had with Jessica on China's role in Africa. My name is David Ansara. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and also let us know what you think in the comments section. Did South Africa do a good job chairing the AU?